A quick note before we begin our podcast. During this podcast, we mention an article that we wrote for folklorethursday.com and is accompanied by this podcast. This podcast is being released before the article. The article that we mention will be released later this month on folklorethursday.com. We just wanted to let you know because it's a little confusing when we mention the article in relation to the podcast during the show. We apologize for any miscommunication and hope you enjoyed the podcast and later this month enjoy the article, which is more in depth on the topics that we speak of tonight, that will be published on folklorethursday.com. Now, on with the show. Welcome to the Monster Guys podcast. My name is DC McGannon, and as always, I'm here with my partner and co-conspirator in all things creative, C. Michael McGannon. And Michael, this week we have an opportunity to do something extra special here on the Monster Guys podcast. We are recording a special episode for folklorethursday.com to accompany our article that is published on their site.
Yeah, it's very exciting. It's a very fun community, and I think a great resource, especially in modern day, for finding all sorts of things folklore.
I would almost venture to say it is the number one global resource for folklore in our modern day.
And if it's not, it's quickly becoming that.
Yeah, and I say that because of this, not because, I'm trying to put them on top of a list over universities or any other community that's out there. I say that because Folklore Thursday is growing rapidly in the global sense that through their hashtag Folklore Thursday on Twitter event that happens every week, obviously on Thursday, there is just a mountain of information that streams through for the entire day. And because they're based in the UK, they're based in England, even if they go to sleep because of the time difference on the other side of the world, the stream just keeps going.
That's true.
And we've had an opportunity to be a part of this, guest hosting with them on Thursdays and now publishing an article with them and through things just like this podcast. And it is just a wonderful community to be a part of. I think we were hanging out with them for probably close to a year before we ever even got involved, just because of the wealth of information and stories, book recommendations, and anything you can possibly imagine folklore, artwork, architecture, little tidbits, anecdotes, and stories that people are sharing. It's almost overwhelming if you're just jumping into the stream for the first time. You have to get in there and just let it happen and tag into something that catches your eye or join a conversation of something that you're interested in. But that's why I say I believe this is possibly the number one global resource for folklore education in the world today. Not because it is, like I said, trying to outdo another resource, but it's kind of bringing together all the current modern resources that are circulating through the airwaves and putting it into one accessible stream.
I'd agree with that. And a note on that is that they actually go back in time as well and find some pretty obscure and solid resources like books from the 1800s and early 1900s. But what I love about it, it has people excited for folklore again.
It absolutely does. They have a number of high visible media pieces that have been done on them, which has increased their popularity through the stratosphere, I believe, in such a short amount of time. But like you said, things like those books, the common person like you and I would never be able to put our hands or our eyeballs on resources like that, just simply because we may not know where to look. and we wouldn't have access to it.
And
but
probably libraries wouldn't let us actually physically put our eyeballs on those
yeah,
books.
well, that too. But, people come up with PDF version that's been released by a university, or a paper that's been written, or another resource that's been released by an organization, and all of a sudden, thousands of us have access to that piece, and it literally is folklore for the people, by the people, for our modern day. It's just a wonderful, wonderful resource. So I would encourage anybody listening, if you have any interest in folklore whatsoever, and we're not talking about just fairy tales, but we're talking about some of the very foundations of countries and civilizations that have been formed around these stories and this architecture and these books and everything else you can possibly imagine to do with folklore and mythology, go to folklorethursday.com, begin there, and just begin to enjoy the rich and vast network of articles and photographs and community that exists there. And then go over to twitter.com and look up Folklore Thursday on Twitter. And their handle is actually at Folklore Thurs. So it's Folklore THURS, but then type in the hashtag Folklore Thursday, and that'll put you right into the stream of information and community on Twitter every Thursday. Now, a lot of people say folklore and they think Little Red Riding Hood or Pixie Dust, Tinkerbell from, Disney World or something. Listen, folks, folklore is powerful and it is deep and it's rich in all manner of stories, film, and like I said earlier, architecture and art, and it covers all the bases. I mean, you can jump into vampires and werewolves, you can jump into fairies, you can jump into kids' fairy tales, you can jump into mermaids. I mean, take your pick, and it exists in folklore. So there's something for everybody in the realm of folklore.
I mean, don't forget the bizarre side of things as well. The shape-shifting conch women from Japan that end up stealing body parts off of pirates. All manner of bizarrities as well.
Definitely something to get involved in. But this episode is an episode that we have recorded for folklorethursday.com. Like I mentioned earlier, it is accompanying our article that's being published on folklorethursday.com, and it is going to reference that article, but it's not going to be verbatim. We're going to hit a few other points for each of the creatures that we're going to be dealing with. The article, by the way, is 5 Legendary Monsters of North American Folklore. We want to go a little bit more in depth, add a little bit more value to the article through this medium, and just have a little bit of fun with it. So, Michael, let's jump into our conversation today, 5 Legendary Monsters of North American Folklore. Legendary monsters thrive in North American lore. Of that, there is no doubt. It would be difficult, foolish even, to attempt to narrow down a top 5 or a most popular listing of creatures that make up the landscape of North American mythology and folklore. Depending on the region you find yourself tooling around in, you could encounter hundreds of creatures if you know where to look. And often, you needn't any wonder of where to look, for the creatures may find you if you're in just the right corner of your local nature park, on the appropriate wooded trail, or poking about a particular set of shrubbery.
And looking at some of those different regions, you have everything from the infamous chupacabra, the goat sucker.
The chupacabra is an amazing creature.
It's a creature, to be sure. But yeah, you have things that go all over the map. You have Momo, which is kind of like a Bigfoot type creature, but very odd and very grotesque at times. You have, of course, the Lake Champ monster, or Champ, or Champy, who's almost like a North American Loch Ness. So you kind of go all over the map. You have what were they called? The fearsome critters of the Paul Bunyan era.
Yeah, these were creatures and stories that frontiersmen would bring back from their travels. Imagine cutting new trails through this country, being out in the wilderness, day in and day out, night in and night out. You go out and you're hearing noises, you're seeing things, and you come back to the campfire later that night and you've got all your stories to share from the things that you have seen or possibly seen and heard or possibly heard. And there was a term that became well known associated with those stories and those monsters, and it was fearsome critters. So we have fearsome critters from coast to coast.
Big fish stories for monsters.
That's right. Big fish stories for monsters. That's a good way of putting it.
So you have all of these creatures like Beast of Bladdenborough and the Loup-garou, which is, interestingly enough, different from the werewolf Loup-garou, but a completely different creature all over North America. And it was our privilege to kind of narrow down 5 of those creatures for our topic.
Other ones come to mind as well: the Hodag, the Bear Lake Monster, La Llorona, different ones like that. Native American legends, I mean, in every corner from coast to coast, north to south. And when we're talking North America, we're not talking about just the U.S. We're talking about the North American continent.
I still definitely want to get into deer people one day.
Yeah, absolutely. There's so many stories and so many creatures and so many monsters, if you will, everywhere you turn. And literally, we could, sit in just one corner of a state and find hundreds just to talk about, and that happens everywhere you go. So we definitely have a lot of North American monsters that we can pull out of the hat. By the way, little heads up, I think we're going to be doing a new article for FolkloreThursday.com in the near future about 5 lesser-known monsters of the North American folklore. So that'll be something extra to look forward to as well. But Michael, no self-respecting list of monsters in North America would be complete without Sasquatch, or more commonly known as Bigfoot. And because you might expect Sasquatch to be on the list, Sasquatch is going to be an extra. We're going to talk about Sasquatch for a moment, but then we're going to give you 5 more. So you're actually getting 6. It's kind of a value pack.
A value pack.
Right? 6 for the price of 5
Are we
type
doing
of
a commercial?
Thing.
And if you call now, you'll also get this free monster.
Absolutely. So Sasquatch definitely is on the list, but I think that's to be expected.
Right. And I think we would also be amiss if we discounted the fact that this is actually found worldwide.
It is. It's a global phenomenon.
What a lot of people also don't always think about or even realize sometimes is that this is found in all eras of time as well. Sasquatch is popular nowadays as Bigfoot, like you said, but you have to remember things like the Woodwoes back in medieval Europe, or the Yeren in China, or the Yeti. He's all over the place, but he's all over time as well, all throughout time. But primarily for our topic today, I think the Bigfoot era of the 1900s is kind of where we want to put our focus.
Yeah, and you know what? The topic of Bigfoot, of Sasquatch, is ever increasing.
It is.
And the sightings and the experiences and the encounters, we talked about this a little bit with reference to Bigfoot and with Dogman. Just the availability of information and the stories that are coming out of the woodwork about the encounters with these creatures is growing at such an epic rate. I'm not sure if the encounters and the experiences with these creatures are increasing so much as our awareness is, but definitely on the landscape of understanding and experience and encounters, Bigfoot is on the rise.
I would say a little bit of both. I would lean more towards the answer of awareness, because you have things like, we've actually talked about Bigfoot and Sasquatch a lot this year on the Monster Guys podcast, specifically with the Fouke Monster or the Beast of Boggy Creek. I think it was this movie or this era that kind of helped spread the story of Bigfoot-like creatures, and of course, that in turn made the Bigfoot title even more exciting and more accessible to the public. But if we take a step back, they've always been known to tribal nations, to the Native Americans as different names really, but Elder Brother or the people over there or the tall folk or the tall people, they were always around. But again, things like the Beast of Boggy Creek, the movie, or different, what almost is like a tourist industry, really make Bigfoot what he is today in pop culture.
Yeah, let me reference Lyle Blackburn's book, Beyond Boggy Creek, In Search of the Southern Sasquatch. Before I do that, Lyle Blackburn is a friend of the Monster Guys podcast. a wonderful storyteller, a Bigfoot researcher. He's written The Beast of Boggy Creek, The True Story of the Fouke Monster, which is a story and a set of events, like you were talking about from the film The Legend of Boggy Creek, that took place in Fouke, Arkansas. But he's also gone on to do a follow-up book, Beyond Boggy Creek in Search of the Southern Sasquatch, and in that book, he lists a number of the names that Bigfoot is known by in certain regions throughout the South. Here's some of those names. The El Reno Chicken Man.
I always forget about that one.
Yeah, and there's a specific story about that. So if you want to know about that full story, you need to check out his book. The Caddo Critter, the Sabine Thing, the Belt Road Booger. And a lot of people don't know this, but especially in the South, monsters or creatures, and especially Bigfoot, is often known as the booger, or another term for the boogeyman, or the bogeyman. Other names that he lists are the Geneva Giant, Nobby, Hollapaw Gorilla, the Arp Ape, the Noxie Monster, and the Cold Point Creature. These are some interesting names, but every one of them are specific to a community or a state or a region that is experiencing multiple encounters of what is known as Bigfoot or Sasquatch. The Bochito Beast, Red River Screamer, Hinton Howler, the Duke Demon, the Walla Ruckus. That name right there just, to me, describes what's going on in the bushes. The Wateree Walking Bear. And the list goes on. So, that's just from southern communities where he's talking to people about specific stories. These creatures showing up in the backyard and hauling off the chickens, or, that type of thing. This doesn't even include the wide range of names and experiences among Native American tribes and cultures over centuries of time. And I find that most interesting. If you talk to some Bigfoot researchers, they'll actually tell you that going back in time, this is a species, not a monster, but a species of people that exist that Native American tribes actually did trading with. They traded with, they communicated with, they coexisted with, and because of the industrialization and the rise of populations in certain areas, and the way some people will tell you humans treat each other, Bigfoot went into hiding. And if you reach back far enough into history, you'll find these stories over and over again. And I find that fascinating. The fact that today Bigfoot researchers, scientists of all color have uncovered a language pattern, family identifications, you name it. They have found it for Bigfoot.
And you talk about language patterns and different ways of identifying them. I think it's also worth noting that people like the Sasquatch Genome Project actually has found DNA, several samples of which they've sent to different labs all across the country, possibly the world, I can't remember. And to me, it's interesting that the statement is that it is part human DNA, specifically that it's human on the mother side, the maternal side, but that the paternal side of the DNA is as of yet unknown. Very interesting, very mysterious, somewhat creepy.
It is, definitely. But it is perhaps the preeminent creature, if you will.
Definitely.
In North America, and perhaps the world. So again, we don't want to exclude him from our list, but we do want to reference him and let you know that Bigfoot is at the top of our list. But we figured you'd probably expect us to say something about Bigfoot, so we did, and now we're going to move on to our list of 5 other legendary monsters of North American folklore. So we're going to start with number 5 and move up the list according to our article. And number 5, Michael, is the Jersey Devil, otherwise known as the Leeds Devil. While every creature on this list is a bizarre oddity in and of itself, the Jersey Devil is perhaps unique in its chimerical nature, both in physical form and the legend surrounding it. The most widely touted folk story tells of one Mrs. Leeds, a woman who was about to give birth to her 13th child in 1735. In some stories, she was a witch, which is intimated might have doomed the child to begin with. According to tradition, and presumably tired of having children, and who could blame her, she commented that the devil could have her next child.
So right off the bat, it's more of a supernatural creature than most other cryptids. Specifically, cryptozoology is a field that says that science hasn't explained these creatures or it hasn't documented these creatures, so it's not necessarily true, although many people believe that they exist, kind of like the Loch Ness Monster and, Bigfoot. A lot of people believe that these things exist. There's some people that are kind of on the fence about it, and then a whole nother group that typically don't believe or are naysayers, if you will. But the scientific community does not recognize them as real creatures or animals. The Jersey Devil is a cryptid, but he's also a zooform because of his chimerical nature and his mysterious nature. It's kind of hard to pin down a solid description of him, but like I said, right off the bat, he is more supernatural in nature, often being described as almost like a dragon, if you will.
Yeah, if you go look at the sketch that's a part of this article, we've shown a sketch that is, I think, back from 1909, if I'm not mistaken, from a newspaper article, from a sighting. An eyewitness sketched this creature. You want to talk bizarre? You see that thing flying around in the sky. I promise you duck and cover.
It is very
bizarre.
Yeah.
So it's not like a bipedal, furry, upright, man-like creature walking around. This is a dragon-like creature made up of several different animal types that's flying around the sky.
Definitely. And part of the issue that many people take with that, probably the reason that it's at the number 5 part on our list, is that many people don't believe it was ever actually true to begin with. Like, this is probably the one that most people have the highest amount of doubt for. Because right off the bat, we have a lot of people that, it was just found out to be a hoax for some people. There was one person that claimed to have caught the creature, and he actually put it up on display, and it was found out later to be partly kangaroo, partly reptilian, just kind of a...
Yeah, he probably killed a lot of animals and then sewed it together.
And then there are other stories that describe this thing being the size of a house. So there's a lot of misinformation and a lot of contradictions in eyewitness sightings, but it stays alive because it's a story that is found throughout literally centuries. It's something that didn't just pop up and appear and then disappear into the nether. This is something that's been around for a very long time. And specifically, you had mentioned 1909. That was actually a year that I think it was within 1 week's period of time, there were hundreds of sightings.
So it comes in waves, and some of it becomes hysteria. Some of it, like you said, is people trying to capitalize on people's fears, misinformation, and everything else. And so you have very sporadic and inconsistent reportings and sightings, but yet it continues. And even today, we have modern sightings, if you will, of the Jersey Devil. You could YouTube it and find all kinds of stuff flying around. And of course, we know that everything on the internet is true, so...
Definitely on YouTube.
We're good to go with that. So, but I would definitely do your research, but as far as North American creatures... This is one of the most popular that we have here, and it is very much alive today.
It is, and it's also worth noting the location. The Jersey Devil is something found in the place called the Pine Barrens.
Mm-hmm.
This is a very large stretch of land that many people consider to be highly dangerous. You and I were actually talking about this earlier. I had kind of made the statement that it is stereotypical to say that people there are outlaws and degenerates. You had corrected me that it wasn't really a stereotype. It was actually very widely known that a lot of moonshiners and a lot of, outlaws and people running from authorities actually hid out there. There were several case studies, or there was a case study done, though, by one man during the era that eugenics was highly reported. And he was actually known for doctoring information that he gathered to support his claims that people in the Pine Barrens were almost mutants because of how degenerated they had become. So there's a heavy amount of that disbelief in the Jersey Devil that comes from just the fact that there's so much stuff that went on at the time in that area.
Yeah, and I've listened to someone recently who lives in New Jersey who spoke of the Pine Barrens, and he spoke of it as a very dangerous place, that he would not on the very best day go near those woods. And he would caution anybody because of personal experience that he had, and then further research of what exists within that area and what is coming out of that area, he would caution anybody going anywhere near that. So I've not been near it. I cannot tell you firsthand, but I can tell you from what people have said and the reports that are out there that there are some interesting things coming out of the Pine Barrens.
As we can see with the Jersey Devil.
Let's move on to number 4 on our list of popular creatures in North American folklore. Number 4, the Flatwoods Monster. Most of the monsters on this list are notable for a mass of sightings or tall tales or peculiar events. The Flatwoods Monster stands apart in that it was seen less often, yet somehow this truly bizarre entity has captured and held the attention of a great many people following the night of September 12th, 1952.
And let me say real quick, most of the creatures on this list are going to be cryptids or zooforms. Cryptids like Bigfoot or zooforms like the Jersey Devil. The Flatwoods Monster, I guess you could kind of say it's a zooform, but for the main eyewitness accounts, it's more of a mechanical monstrosity. It is something that many people, especially nowadays looking back into that terrifying night, they agree that it's more of a suit. And this is going to go into kind of some UFO and alien territory, but they describe it as being a terrestrial suit for whatever was in there to navigate the world and some people believe survive. So this is not something that's necessarily organic or flesh and blood even. On that special night, there were actually a few boys playing in the area when they say they saw a UFO crash. And they ran and told their mother. She and some other people that were around went with the boys to go see what it was all about. So these 7 eyewitnesses got close to that area, and instead of seeing a UFO, they saw these bright lights, and then they saw this 7 to 10 foot mechanical creature start to float or hover toward them. And then it seemed to be following this kind of red orb or red light, and it actually turned away from them and bound the other way. So that's the general account of the Flatwoods Monster. Now, at the time, the media kind of took it and created this spin on it that was very different. It almost made it to be flesh and blood at times after the initial, I don't want to say discovery, but after the initial report. And many people believe this is purposeful misinformation. Some people believe it was just, obsession at the time that got misconstrued. But many years later, we look back and find researchers going back and talking to those eyewitnesses to this day, and they make it very clear that their sightings were kind of skewed by the media and changed around for entertainment value, for lack of a better term.
Yeah, and remember as well, the time of the initial encounters here is a time in America specifically when the public was enamored with alien conspiracy, alien abduction, UFO sightings. There was just an increasing rash of these sightings and experiences and abductions that were being reported coast to coast. And so in the midst of all that, you have the Flatwoods Monster, this mechanical, some has described even like an owl-like creature that came out of these woods and approached these people, heart-shaped face of an owl. Some have even described it as looking like the ace on a playing card. Just all kinds of interesting descriptions. And for what reason? I'm not really sure.
When I looked up the Flatwoods Monster for the first time, the common image reminded me of something that would come out of a twisted version of Alice in Wonderland, like some weird Queen of Hearts.
Very much.
But that's not what it was. That's not what they reported at all.
And I almost think back to the story, not in terms of the creature itself, but in terms of its existence, its revelation, and its purpose. I think back to things like the Owlman that took place in England. What for?
Yeah.
Just to scare people? Was it a creation of a government, of a group of people, of just somebody fooling around trying to scare people or create a story? I don't know. It's strange.
Well, there are many, many theories out there. I don't think that we could answer that in this podcast, just because it's a brief introduction, if you will. But one thing to note is that, you were talking about the UFO craze at that time. That specific night, though, and that 48-hour period, had a lot of weird stuff going on.
Yeah, it did.
The government, for one, during that period of time, was contradicting itself on public statements about UFOs.
Mm-hmm.
Some saying, yeah, these exist. Others saying that, no, these have never existed. You guys are all just crazy, basically. And then some people saying, these don't exist, but we're preparing for battle. Well, why are you preparing for battle if there's
Right.
nothing going on?
Right.
But you also have to remember that there were alarm panics going on at the time where fighter jets were basically on call in case anything happened. And then you have some planes just flat out going missing.
Well, and some of them were chasing these lights in the skies, if I remember correctly, and then one or more of them going missing during this period of time.
And this was going on over an extended period of time, but this activity was actually heightened on the same night that the Flatwoods Monster was spotted. So a lot of people say that there's a very large conspiracy surrounding this, that there's a cover-up of information that actually went on and that occurred.
A strange creature indeed in American folklore. It's one that has certainly left its mark here, especially in the United States.
Oh, yeah. They're still selling T-shirts in that town.
Still selling T-shirts. I believe there's a museum. I believe there's a festival surrounding this. You can actually go visit a number of locations that have architecture and goods that are related to the Flatwoods Monster. So certainly a creature that has left a lasting mark on North American folklore. Let's move to number 3. Number 3, Mothman. The Mothman is not only one of North America's most well-known creatures, it's also one of the greatest examples of cryptids and zooforms firmly lodged in the flying human category.
Most people are going to be familiar with this, but for the people who are asking right now, what the heck is a Mothman? Let's talk about that. So the Mothman is just, like you said, a flying humanoid, probably the most commonly known one. Typically, he's described as being this dark, blurry shape. Some would say he has feathery skin. Some would say that he has leathery skin. Typically, he's sketched out or illustrated in such a manner that you see the feet, you see kind of this necklace head, and then you see wings. And then you also see the red eyes. I almost forgot about that. But you see these bright, glowing eyes. So it's a very strange, very distinct figure, but one that does not give a lot of actual detail at the same time. Many people have theories out the wazoo, from very strange things like Atlantean, I'm talking about the old city of Atlantis that was lost, but Atlantean human-animal hybrids, to a government experiment gone wrong, to aliens, to just some bizarre cryptid that flies out there on its own. But this creature was seen over a 13-month period of time. Beyond a year. You see him, and some other occurrences as well, but you see the Mothman in Point Pleasant becoming more and more popular, having more and more sightings, until this, as far as we know, it's unrelated. This collapse of the Silver Bridge, at which point people stop paying attention to the Mothman. The sightings include everything from people saying that a large bird was chasing their car, to other people saying that they saw the Mothman in their house. Some people actually, like two guys on motorcycles, actually describe seeing the Mothman standing on top of kind of a dilapidated warehouse building. And they actually stopped going along the road to go inside that building and see him, and they heard the flapping of his wings, which is very interesting, because then you have some other sightings that talk about him being able to fly without the use of his wings, almost hover around like a drone would these days.
Right. The Mothman sightings in Point Pleasant, West Virginia, seem to be the focus, but there are a number of sightings and reportings that have taken place around West Virginia, and other sightings across the U.S. and even around the world that are similar to the Mothman. Not always looking exactly like, and maybe just a single occurrence, others over a period of weeks. So it is a very interesting and baffling phenomenon. And we, in our article, have referenced Seth Breedlove, Lyle Blackburn, and their company Small Town Monsters, who produce film documentaries about many of these type of creatures, and their most recent production is Mothman of Point Pleasant.
Great production, by the way.
Yeah, it's a wonderful film. If you have interest in learning more about the Mothman, some really deep mysteries unraveled from within that community and people who were there and people who have still firsthand experiences of things that took place there, I encourage you to check out Mothman of Point Pleasant by Small Town Monsters. And it's available, I think, pretty much anywhere you can download video or even get your hands on it at their website. But certainly worth the look. Probably the most extensive piece of research documentation about this cryptid so far. It even has images and video in this film that has never been seen before, not even in the Mothman movie that was produced by Hollywood. So it's a very exciting and mysterious and powerful documentary to this creature. Michael, some of the other things surrounding the Mothman really have me interested. Things like Men in Black, government activity, alien abduction, UFO sightings, and that kind of thing that were prevalent and very common on a day-to-day basis almost. People in that community would actually gather daily sometimes and go to a specific point because they knew they were going to see something.
So we talked about the UFO craze with the Flatwoods Monster. It's prevalent here as well, but there's a different movement, a related movement, but a different movement of the Men in Black here as well. Now, before the Mothman, the Men in Black did appear, but they were almost like shadow people, which is a completely different topic, but they basically would appear silently, aggressively, oftentimes in people's houses, and kind of rough people up, just act very menacingly toward them. Here, though, you have the Men in Black appearing to talk to people and have conversations with them and ask things like, what town is this? Or, do you have a few minutes that we could talk to you and come in and it'll only take this amount of time? There are some instances of them being aggressive, but not as much as in the past. And it's funny, this is actually where the inspiration for the franchise Men in Black, with Tommy Lee Jones and Will Smith comes from. So it is a fascinating set of phenomena that kind of conglomerated in this 13th month period of time. Something to take note of specifically with Mothman as well is the feeling that he seems to have around him at all times. Most people that sight him or are around him generally describe a feeling of sadness or dread. Some people actually said they felt hate or anger. But it's very similar to the phenomenon of infrasound that only a certain amount of the population is affected by. So a lot of people wonder if he puts off this same sound that's below auditory levels, or if there's something else that he was trying to convey through all sorts of ways, really, with the different theories that are out there.
Yeah, and we write a little bit more about that and Mothman's possible connection to shadow people, or at least the similarities between the two, in the article that we've written for folklorethursday.com. So we encourage you to read there and get a little bit more information about the Mothman of Point Pleasant. On to number 2 on our list. Number 2, Dogman. For as long as humans have been telling stories, werewolves have roamed the fictional lands of our tales. But if you were to roll up and propose to someone that these legendary beasts could be real, and further that you've seen one, you'd surely be laughed straight out of the pub, right?
You're actually more versed in the topic of Dogman than I am. I don't know, when people started talking about that for the first time around me, I raised the question, what the heck is Dogman? That sounds like something that's very similar to Goatman or Skinwalkers, and it's pretty close, actually. It's basically what most people would consider to be a modern-day werewolf. I feel like that doesn't really give credit to what it actually is. It's not something that, is turning into this beast at the full moon. This is a species, almost like a wolf-headed Bigfoot, that constantly roams the woods or roams the fields.
Imagine getting out of your vehicle after a long day at work. It's nighttime, you're tired, you're hungry, and you just want to go in, grab a bite to eat, and go to sleep. Instead, what happens is you get out of your vehicle and you feel like something is watching you. This is a common experience for humans. But imagine turning around and seeing two glowing amber eyes staring back at you, and you hear a low rumbling growl that is so deep and powerful that it shakes your chest. You feel it inside, and the fear that this thing puts off overtakes you and overwhelms you. You see it stand up on its hind legs to up over 7 feet tall. The fierce musculature, the coarse, thick hair covering most of its body, long arms that end in large extended claws resembling the claws of a raccoon, only massive, and a head that looks like a cross between a wolf and a Doberman pinscher, with its ears jutting straight up in the sky like it's on alert. And this is what's growling at you.
Thanks, I didn't need to sleep tonight.
Round that out with these terrifying fangs, and like I mentioned before, these eyes that glow amber. Some people report them glowing red or orange, and you have the picture of the Dogman. This has been cited now for decades across North America. Now we're hearing reports from around the world in every country of this creature either approaching people and striking the deepest level of fear and terror in their lives imaginable, or they happen upon it by accident, getting out of their vehicle, driving down the road, passing by an abandoned building. More often these days than not, Dogman showing up in cities and towns and villages where population centers are thick, and possibly more often now in the daytime than in the nighttime. So there's not a place, there's not a time, there's not a location, there's not a situation where we don't have a report of Dogman sightings and encounters on the books today.
It's creepy to think about. And this is something that I feel like it's, again, very similar to Bigfoot, where it's a matter of awareness versus just more sightings. I feel like, yes, there are more sightings because populations are getting closer to their areas, or possibly their populations are growing as well. But it's just a matter of people seeing these things and being more attuned to them, if you will.
Yeah, and just like Sasquatch, we have reports of Dogmen living as families. We're talking about, this is going to sound really strange, but husband and wife Dogmen and their children living on acreage shared by humans and even having interactions with humans. But for the most part, terrifying encounters with these creatures that leave a person marked for the rest of their lives. And often even going to the extent where they now have been diagnosed with PTSD and other conditions because of their encounters with this creature. We're talking about military personnel, trained hunters, woodsmen, people just walking home at night, walking down through their neighborhood. We have stories of people who are walking down the street and being flanked by 2 different Dogmen. If you can imagine it, the story probably exists about a Dogman encounter in the world today. So it is terrifying. What I find even more interesting about this creature, possibly than any other, is that there are a significant amount of reports that where Dogmen exist or have been encountered or been reported, there are also Sasquatch in the area. And many people have reported that upon encountering Dogmen, Sasquatch has revealed himself as a protector of the humans. In other words, when Sasquatch shows up, the Dogman leaves. And there seems to be a communication that takes place that the humans are not to be messed with. I don't know if it gets any stranger than that.
Probably not.
But that's what we're talking about here with Dogman.
Well, I guess you have Chupacabra in terms of strangeness.
I guess that could be stranger, but I'll tell you this much. After learning as much as I've learned about Dogman over the past year or so, and listening to people who I would consider experts on the topic, and even more listening to just everyday people like you and me that are going to work, raising a family, coming home, listening to their stories and their encounters and their experiences, this is the one creature that causes me to look twice if I'm in the woods. I have no, and you know this, and we've talked about this before on the Monster Guys podcast, I have very little fear of anything out there, so to speak. I'm not saying that to be arrogant. I don't. It's just one of those things. I guess I've been built this way, but Dogman is one of those things that if I have that feeling, I'll take a second look over my shoulder or through the trees because I want to be sure. So it's an interesting and a very powerful legend and piece of folklore in North America today. Let's go to number 1 on our list and one of my favorite pieces of North American folklore, period. Number 1, Wendigo. In the winter, and particularly in the wild north, hunger is its own animal. One more threat in a harsh world of the frozen wilderness. Sometimes, tragically, in order to survive, people turn on each other, starving and on the brink of death. Cannibalism. In the eyes of some Native American cultures, this is one of the ultimate sins. As such, according to their stories, it is met with one of the most terrible fates, to become something inhuman, ghastly, and always hungry.
So we have the Wendigo, the Wendigo, the Witiko. It's described by many different names. These are spirits of hunger incarnate. It's said that if you succumb to the hunger in the winter and you're out on your own with your friend or your family, and you either end up killing them and eating them or just surviving off of their corpse, one way or another, you have committed such a great sin that you are going to become possessed by the spirit of the Wendigo, or you're going to just simply become the Wendigo itself. Now, these things are described differently regionally, but they appear as either ice giants or as more spectre-like creatures that float around and are so thin that if you look at them from a certain angle, they are like paper because of how hungry and how starved they are. These are horrific creatures. And no matter, it's almost like a vampire, the classic idea that no matter how much blood they drink, they can never be satiated. These things are ravenous, and no matter how much meat or how much human flesh they consume, their stomachs are always caved in. They're always wanting more.
And this is the story of the Wendigo as a legend, as a monster, as a creature. While some people speak of ice giants, others still believe the Wendigo to be a scary story to tell around the campfire, to scare little children into obedience. That's not always the case. There's a whole nother side to this, and it's what is termed as the Windigo Psychosis, also known as the Witiko condition. And it's an actual mental case. It's a medical term describing something that has happened to a human being. And it's a culture-bound syndrome found among the Algonquian people. People with Windigo Psychosis believe themselves to have been cursed or doomed to the horrible fate of becoming a Wendigo, that creature, that legend that you were speaking of, or being possessed by one. To make matters worse, the paranoia starts to turn some, causing them to attack their friends and families, devolve into strange and violent fits, or begin to crave human meat. One of the most famous cases, Michael, is that of Swift Runner.
Swift Runner is a very tragic case of a man who he was described as being this big, ugly teddy bear. He was known for being well-versed as a woodsman. He was a very loving father and husband, and generally well-liked within the community. One year, he and his family went up into their campsite and didn't come down for a while. I believe it was wintertime. So when he came back, though, his family was not with him. And he, I think, checked himself into the local church, basically. At night, his nightmares were so bad that he would scream out in the night, and the priests began to notice, or the people there began to notice that something was off. So they actually went and got the authorities of that time and took Swift Runner to their campsite, or his campsite. What they found there were bones, scattered clothing, remains basically of his family. And after some questioning and after he kind of dodged the answers, he finally broke down and admitted that he had killed and eaten his family, and done so in pretty grotesque ways. He had even gone so far as describing that he had talked, I think, one of his children into killing and also eating some of those same family members before he, ate him as well.
Right.
So it's a very tragic case. A lot of people just tell that side of the story. Some people actually go and point out that even before this, he was known for being kind of a drunk at times and a violent drunk, even despite being well liked amongst the community. But that in and of itself was not enough to describe the severity and the extremes that were found at that campsite. So you have a couple of cases like this. That's probably the most notorious case. You also have the case of other people who were known as Wendigo killers and would actually kill people who were thought to be in the process of becoming the Wendigo so that they did not succumb to this evil and go on a killing spree similar to Swift Runner.
Yeah, all in all, this dealing with the truth of the Windigo condition or the Windigo Psychosis or the Windigo condition is very tragic. There are a lot of people that dive into the legend, into the mythology and the stories about beasts that are running through the frozen wilderness or live in the woods and that type of thing. And they can, in and of themselves, be horrifying stories. But the truth is that there are a great number of tribes of Native Americans who have lived with this and had to deal with this as a part of their community throughout the centuries. Recently, we had the opportunity to hear a Native American elder speak on the topic of the Wendigo, and his words were strong and serve as a good reminder with any monster or legend, really. And I believe we referenced this in our notes in the citations in the article that we wrote for folklorethursday.com. I would encourage you to read that article and sift through some of that information because there's more to hear on this. But basically, he talked about how the story and the information about the Wendigo is for his people. And it's not just for entertainment and not just a ghost story to be told around the campfire, but it was very real and it's tragic and it is terrifying. He pleaded with his audience to treat each other with respect and care to the best of their abilities. That being good to one another would keep such spirits and such evil from becoming commonplace.
Yeah, it's interesting. I cannot remember if we talk about this in the article, but he had gone so far as to say that, or imply that there was some sort of spiritual cleansing, a reason that so many Wendigo cases had arisen at one point, and that in that same reason, there was a reason that you don't see quite as many today. You do see sightings of skinwalkers, you do have Wendigo cases that happen even to this day, but he had talked about this almost a generational spiritual cleansing that happened because people were not being kind, because people were not treating each other with that same respect that he was talking about. So it is a very real thing. It's something that was not to be taken lightly by any means.
I believe his words are words that we would do well to heed, regardless of whether we're talking about legendary monsters or just everyday living with our neighbors. So, pull up a chair. The North American map is dotted with a captivating collection of fantastic beasts and fearsome critters. We are spellbound by the fancy of some, terrified by the horror of others, but eternally enchanted with our legends and lore. And if you should choose to visit us, spare us a moment and pull up a chair, and allow us the pleasure of sharing with you a story or two. We'll let you be on your way in no time, but depending on which way you're heading, you may do well to avoid that trail yonder. Or maybe, if you're at all like most of us adventurous folk, you may wish to take that trail just to see for yourself. As always, thank you for joining us on the Monster Guys podcast. You can find out more about us at themonsterguys.com, follow us on Twitter at The Monster Guys, like us on Facebook at The Monster Guys, and we encourage you to become involved with the community of folklorethursday.com. You can also find them on Twitter at folklorethurs, that's folklore, THURS, or use the hashtag on Twitter, Folklore Thursday, and they're also on Facebook as Folklore Thursday. In the meantime, thanks for joining us, and we hope you enjoyed our walk through 5 legendary creatures of North American folklore. Good night, everyone.
Good night.